So yeah, I'm David Kais. I run R for the Rest of Us. It's a company. We do kind of two different things. We do education on one side, helping people to learn R. We focus on a lot of people who are kind of just starting out with R. Then we also do consulting work where organizations who want to use the power of R but don't want to learn it themselves, or maybe they know some R but not enough to do what they need to do. They bring us in to help do whatever thing it is. And a lot of times what we've ended up doing is building reports for folks. We do a lot of parameterized reporting. And one thing that becomes really important in this is being able to build reports that are reproducible, of course, especially because we're doing parameterized reporting. But also they need to be beautiful and beautiful, not just because, for aesthetic reasons, but a lot of times the work that we do is communicating technical data to lay audiences. And so being able to design reports that look good is really key in that mission. And so I'm going to talk today about our process for doing this. And before I start, I just want to say that I am presenting this, but the work that I'm going to be talking about is done by several consultants at R for the Rest of Us. So Thomas Froilant is the person who really got me into pagedown. Charlie Hadley also does a bunch of pagedown stuff for us, Kara Thompson as well, and Jocelyn Rocha Hidalgo. So I'm really building on what they have done. I'm the messenger here. So I'm going to be talking about the pagedown package. If you've never heard of the pagedown package, it is a unique way to make PDF reports. And what I'm talking about today is exclusively making PDF reports. And the problem that we generally encounter is this. We need to create PDF reports. Our clients come to us and they want to have a set of PDF reports, say, that go on their website. And they've heard that they can potentially make those with R, but they're not really sure how, and they're especially not sure how to make something that's going to actually look decent. PDFs, even though those of us in the R community might like to always use things like HTML as our output format, people still tend to use PDFs. A lot of people do. They're portable, right? Like you can send it to anybody, it'll look exactly the same on their device as it does on yours. And they're just extremely widely used. Now, those of us, before I get into that, there are a couple of solutions that people tend to think of when the remit is to make a PDF report. Number one is to work with a graphic designer. So I've worked in situations where all I have done is made a whole bunch of data viz, and then I share it with the graphic designer, and they do the layout in InDesign or whatever tool that they use. And that's fine, but obviously it's not really reproducible. And in cases where we need to do parameterized reporting, it's not really going to work. This is an example of a report that a client at Johns Hopkins, who we were actually just wrapping up with. It's a report on pneumonia and diarrhea around the world, the impact that it's had, especially on children. And they came to us actually shared this report. They get the data every year. It's a bunch of data from different sources. And their process has been, they import the data manually. They make a bunch of data viz, often with Excel. Then they send that to the designer. The designer manually makes the tables and they put it together. And they've told us it's kind of a scramble, right? Because the data comes in, this report gets released early November. The data comes in, I think, late October. So they really have a scramble. And so they came to us to help us, implement this in R Markdown. And I'll show you at the end what we did with that. And so there's some problems, right, with this kind of traditional way of working. If you're using a graphic designer, it's just not the most efficient. So for our users, we tend to think of using LaTeX as a solution to make PDFs. Like when I tell people, oh, yeah, we make a ton of PDFs. So like, oh, cool, you do use LaTeX. I actually have never used LaTeX. I've never learned it. But from what I've heard, there's some problems with it. Number one, the default output looks awful. So if you don't customize it in any way, you end up with this, which everybody has seen. I've also just heard from people, and apologies if I'm offending anybody, but the number of tweets I see from people complaining about LaTeX are significant. So I've gathered here 3 of my favorites. And so from everything I've heard, LaTeX is just very finicky, right? So if you already know LaTeX and you're good with it, by all means, like, please go ahead. But for those of us who are not, there's another approach. And that approach is using the pagedown package. Why pagedown? So pagedown, the way it works is you actually do your design and your layout using HTML and CSS. And that may seem unusual, right? Because like we're making a PDF in the end, but the way pagedown works is it actually does the layout with HTML and CSS, and then uses a JavaScript library called page.js, which I'll talk about in a second, and it converts it into a paged document. From what I've heard, HTML and CSS are way easier to learn than LaTeX. It's also easier to reuse parts of what you do on the in pagedown on a website or in other formats like Sharingan, Blogdown, etc. And the outputs, in my humble opinion, generally look nicer than what you end up with LaTeX. So this is an example of a report we did. This was for a client in Connecticut on kind of housing and demographic data. We had to produce one report for each town and county in the state of Connecticut. There were 170 something of these reports. So being able to do the layout, everything in R was key, right? Because like working with a graphic designer just would not be feasible. And so this is an example of what you can do working just in R. Another one is this. We worked with a client who was putting together reports here in the US based on outreach efforts in the 2020 census. So there was one report for just about every state. And we made these reports, parameterized reports, again, entirely in pagedown. One more I'll show you. This was working with an organization based in Colorado, but again, they were doing reports across the country here in the US, looking at childhood bereavement. So sad topic, kids who have lost family members. And so you can see this is the Oregon report where I'm based in Portland, but there was one report like this for each state in the US. So let's talk briefly about how pagedown works, and then I'll actually kind of demo it so you can get a sense. So pagedown, it's an R package, provides custom output formats. You call it using pagedown, :HTML paged in the YAML header. And then you use the CSS argument to provide a custom style sheet. And so again, I'm going to walk through this so you can see exactly how it works. Behind the scenes, what happens is it uses, again, the page.js library. You don't have to know anything about the page.js library. I know the absolute minimum, just enough to work with it. But what happens is you start with an R Markdown document. Pandoc and CSS convert it into an HTML web page. Then the page.js library uses the CSS file that you've made and lays it out as a page document, as an HTML document. And I'll show you, you can actually open up the HTML document that you create. And then using the Chrome printing device, it converts it to a PDF. Now, the nice thing is you don't have to like do these steps manually. You'll see when I'm working in our studio in a second, I'll just hit the knit button and it'll automatically generate a PDF for me. So that's just my text of exactly what I just said. So before I get into pagedown, while I said that HTML and CSS are a bit more common today than knowledge of them than LaTeX, I know that not everybody knows HTML and CSS. I'm going to give like the absolute minimum overview of how they work. So when you work with HTML and CSS, HTML creates kind of like the bricks of your document. It's like the structure. And so you can have large bricks. H1s, H2, H3, and these show up in our Markdown. You create first level headers, second level headers, third level headers, etc. You can have regular text bricks. So again, just text in our Markdown document that would end up as a paragraph element in HTML. And then the CSS is what controls kind of what the bricks end up looking like. Size of things like text size, color, shape, etc. And so this is what Thomas, my consultant, put together to kind of highlight how HTML is the bricks, and then CSS is, in this case, the color of what they end up looking like. So the one thing I'll mention before I dive into actual work in RStudio to show you what this looks like is that within pagedown, there's some very unique HTML/CSS that you're not going to see anywhere else. This is taken from the page.js website. And because page.js ends up taking an HTML document and kind of laying it out as if it were a paged document, there are specific areas that you can kind of target. So you can see the main area in the center, we're going to target with @page. And then there are also things you'll see in a minute. I will target like bottom left corner, bottom right corner. Maybe you want to put a logo or a page number, that kind of thing. So just know, I'm not expecting anyone to kind of, commit this to memory, but the message I want you to take is that you are going to see some things today that if you have used HTML and CSS and you're like, what is David talking about? I've never seen this. It's probably because it's specific to the page.js library. All right, so let's go ahead and make a very simple pagedown report. So obviously, if you are using pagedown for the first time, you need to install the package, same as you would any other package. That part's pretty simple. From there, you're able to create a document using a custom template. So I'm at this point going to kind of flip back and forth between my slides and RStudio, and I am going to make these bigger. This is a document that I will get into in a second. But just so you know, after you have installed the pagedown package, you'll go to New File, our Markdown, and then you can select From Template, go down, and this is the one, Paged HTML document. So let me go ahead and actually make this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete a bunch of stuff because there's a bunch of text basically, and I don't want to have to wait for it to render. I'm going to uncomment one line and I'm going to knit this, and while it knits, I'm going to talk about what's going on. So what happens, you can see I'm using the pagedown HTML paged. There's this line here that shows up commented by default if you just make a blank document using this template. But what this does is if you have this line in your YAML, it will first convert your example.rmd to HTML. And from there, it will then convert it into a PDF. So if you actually look here in my files, you can see I have example.html, and then I have example.pdf. I'm just going to open up the PDF for now to show you. This is the kind of default that you end up with. Obviously, I took out most of the text. I think we just have, the introduction. But this is a PDF, right? Like we made a PDF using pagedown straight from RStudio. For some reason, the HTML document is not showing up right now in my browser, so I'm going to skip that. But just know you can, actually, I'll show you when we get to the template that I'm going to make. I'll show you that in my browser. So let's go ahead and change a few things. Actually, let me go back here. If you were eagle-eyed, you may have noticed that the page size on this is slightly unusual, at least for me as an American. It's 6 by 9 inches by default. And I can see that here. I know it might be a bit small for folks watching. But let's talk about how we can kind of change both the page size and then the margins to kind of tweak our document. So to handle pages, pagedown has a special CSS element called page. Remember that image that I showed you. And so the thing that you have to do at the beginning is you have to set its size. And if I do this, if I add this code within my CSS at page and then size 8.5, I'm going to do 8.5 by 11 inches. Apologies to folks outside the US. I'm an American, so pretty traditional size here. But you can set whatever size you want. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I am going to, actually, no, sorry, let me go in here. Let me open up. So I made, actually, Thomas made a template.rmd, just a document here where we just added some filler text. And you'll see when I knit it, we have a couple plots that we'll make. So I have my style.css, which I'm calling here. So you can see my CSS gets called. There's nothing in it. So what I've done in the template folder is I have created a series of CSS files that I'm going to copy from. So I'm going to first just copy that. Let me stop that. Let me save this. Let me knit that. And while that's knitting, you'll see all I'm doing is just changing the page size to be 8.5 by 11. And so you can see it's running. It first tells me that it's making that HTML. And actually, I can now bring that over and just show you really quick. Here is my HTML document. It looks a little weird at this point. But the thing to know is this is an HTML document specifically laid out to become a PDF. So if I now open up my template.pdf, you can see I have a PDF document here. Not the most exciting thing at this point, but I've got something. So the other thing I'm going to change now is the margins. This is, again, specific page.js stuff here. There are some what are called CSS variables that you can target. So you can see and kind of guess what they're doing, right? Margin left, margin right, margin bottom, margin top. So if I go back into this, and I'm just going to copy that whole thing into my style.css. I'm going to knit this again. And now what'll happen, I don't actually know what the default margins are, but what it's going to do is it's going to change the margins to that. So it changed it slightly just to prove to you that it actually changed them. I'm going to change the top margin to 4 inches and just knit that again. And then it'll be incredibly obvious. So creates my HTML back to here. There you go. Now, I don't think that's very attractive, but just to prove to you that that does work. All right, so now we've kind of dealt with like the overall layout. We've converted, or we've changed our page size, tweaked our margins. Let's talk about fonts. It's using the default font, which I think is Times New Roman, although I'm not 100% certain on that. But let's say we want to use a custom font. For the rest of us, we often use a font called Inter. I have taken this code from Google Fonts, and I am going to use it in order to import my font. Let me actually just show you. If I bring this over here, if I go to Google Fonts and show you kind of where you get this code from. So I'm going to find Inter. There's Inter font. Let me remove. So once I select my font, if you find this import over here, oh, I have some other ones here that I was working with before. So let me remove those. I'm going to go down, and you just need to select the weights that you want. Like, do you want just to use regular weight? Do you also want to have a bold weight? Do you want to use italics? If you want to use italics, this doesn't have italics built in. But in any case, you select whatever fonts you want. And then within that import, you can see that's the code that I was showing just a second ago. So that's how you're going to get that that import code. Then what we do, we have that font available to us. So now I'm going to be able to use it throughout. And so, for example, I'm going to say body font family, and this is just some basic CSS. I'm going to say body font family inter, and then this just means if for some reason inter doesn't work, just use the default sans serif font. Then what I'm doing is in my H1, H2, so H3, et cetera, all my headers, I'm saying make them font weight 700. So in other words, make them bold. And then I'm setting the font size to be 12 points for all of my paragraph text. So I am going to now open up style fonts. What I've done is I have included the page and margins, that same stuff down here, and then some additional things. Oh, actually, I forgot to show one last thing. I'm also going to tweak the block quote style. So if you may or may not have noticed, it's not very obvious before we tweak it. This is actually a block quote. And so I am going to the margin inline start. That's just a minor tweak in terms of the margins. I'm basically setting it to a different color. It's a light blue that I use for the rest of us, setting some padding, giving it a little bit of padding, putting a border on the left side and making it italics. So let me go ahead and copy all that, paste it into my style.css, and then I'm going to go ahead and knit it again. And so hopefully this is helpful to see kind of like how you can build it up piece by piece to make a decent looking PDF document. All right, so that has created. So you can see everything is now, make this bigger. Everything is now using that inter font. All my headers are bold. This text, the paragraph text is 12-point font. And then if I go down to my block quote, there it is, styled in the way I wanted to style it. All right, moving right along. Let's talk about the footer. You might want to add things like a page number, maybe a logo. And so this is going to get back to something specific to page.js. Remember that we had like that bottom left corner, bottom right corner. I'm going to target those elements and add some content there. So what I'm doing, I'm adding on, I already had my page and I had that, size 8.5 by 11. Now I'm saying in the bottom left corner, we're going to do this. It's slightly weird CSS, but we actually say make the content blank, don't add anything, but have a background image, which is an SVG RRU logos are for the rest of us logo. And then we're just doing some things, telling it like not to repeat, setting the size of it and the position. Here in the bottom right corner, what I'm going to do is say this content counter page is something specific to page.js that's going to add the page number. And I am going to say I want it to be gray and I want it to be 10 points, so it's a little bit smaller. So I'm going to go into style footer, copy all that into here. Let me knit that and I'll just show you as that's knitting that I've got all my font stuff. Basically, each time I copy a new CSS, it's got everything that came before, as well as the new things that we just talked about. So when I do that, got my PDF. And if you look there, I've got the R for the rest of us logo. And here I've got my page number. All right, a couple other tweaks that I'm going to show you. One thing you might want to add is a cover page. And so the way you can target that with page.js, you can target page : first, which says, this is what I want to happen, but only on the first page. And so here, what I'm going to actually do is do a background of a dark hex pattern.svg. It's actually this same pattern that you're seeing on the inverse slides that I'm using. And then note that I also have to say bottom left corner background none and bottom right corner content none. The reason why I have to do that is if we don't add anything, because remember here in our footer, we added content in the bottom left corner and the bottom right corner. If I don't add that, this is to override what I set before. And so we'll end up with a logo and the page number on the cover page, which is not really what we want. So flipping back to RStudio, I'll do the, whoops, not the footer, cover, copy that, save that, knit that. Takes just a second. Make my HTML, make my PDF. So this is taking just a tiny bit longer because now we're adding some images that it has to include as well. Great. And now if I go up here, I've got that. Oh, and I realized actually I forgot to mention a couple other things that I added. So I added my title. I made my title white, 36-point font. And then the date here, which is that, I made that white, font weight normal, 18-point. And this is just saying, after you put that element, do a page break. So don't have like this text show up right below the date, do a page break and then edit. All right, I think there's one more thing. So that's that. Last thing I'll mention is we do a lot of multi-column layouts. So if you remember, for example, this one, it's not just like straight up and down, right? Like we'll do, text on the left side and then say an image that's, from ggplot on the right side. The way we do that is using what's called CSS Flexbox. This is the most complicated CSS that I'll mention today. But the way it works is you have to tell the page down or use the CSS that says, for this section, I want this to be treated not as elements that should go one on top of the other. Instead, they should go next to each other. And so we're going to set a class called wrap columns, which will be to tell the CSS that treat this, side by side. And then I'm going to make some CSS that's called columns 50, which will say make one part on 50% on the left side, the other part 50% on the right side. And so you can see I've got that. I do need to add image max width 100. That's just because when you're making ggplot, if you don't add that, the plots will overlap each other. Then I've got my wrap columns, display flex. This padding just means like don't add any padding around that. And then columns 50 is just a CSS class that I made. Let me actually paste that in, run that. So it's just a CSS class that I made that will make it so that each item will show up at 50% width. All right, so that's knitting. And got my PDF. So now, if I go down here, you can see, in this case, I just have two plots side by side. You could also have like text and plot, whatever you want to have. And just to show you the code that did that, you can see here, we're doing wrap columns around that area. And then I'm doing a div, which is a HTML element to say this should be 50% and this should also be 50%. And so I know, in the beginning, I teased the report from the folks that we were working with at Johns Hopkins, where they were doing it essentially by hand. This is actually the report. It was released yesterday, and this was made by Kara Thompson and Jocelyn Rocha Hidalgo, entirely in pagedown, using R and pagedown. So summing up, you can make nice PDFs straight from R. You do need to know some HTML and CSS, but hopefully I showed you that it's not always you don't need to go like super, super deep. You can do a lot with just a little bit. And hey, at least it's not LaTeX. Last thing I'll mention is that you don't want to go into tweaking everything. Thomas Roiland and I, although mostly Thomas, made a package called Page Report. It's not on CRAN. If you go to pagereport.rfortherestofus.com, you can learn about it. And what it does is it provides a set of templates that you can then tweak. You can choose colors, your own cover image, fonts to make it, whatever kind of look and feel you want to have. Last thing I'll mention, folks I know may be sitting on this call thinking, wait, he's talking about R Markdown, but everyone's moving to Quarto. What about Quarto? Unfortunately, and this is taken from a GitHub thread, it's not, pagedown is not yet, or pagedown equivalent is not yet available in Quarto. You can see JJ Allaire of Posit talking about how it's not likely to be available before the end of the year. Our hope is that by next year, in 2023, it will be available and we can start using it. Additional resources, if you're interested, if you want to learn about pagedown, there's documentation page and the issues on GitHub. And I can share a link that can go on the website for this conference with these links, a link to the slides. So to get a deeper knowledge of the foundations, if you really want to, you can look at the page.js documentation or their GitLab, and then a couple ideas for learning about HTML and CSS. And with that, I will wrap up and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. That's incredible, David.